Hi, my name's Dr. Sarah Gordon. I'm going to take a couple minutes of your time just to walk you through our very simple 4-step process for the management of risk. Now, as you'll recognise, these 4 steps are nothing new, and in fact they very much come from all of those different international standards for risk management you will have come across in the past. All we've done is to pull out the most basic points from each of those standards to thereby make it much easier for you to be able to integrate and embed this form of risk management into those systems and processes that you've probably already got in place within your organisation. So, step number one. Step number 1 is all about understanding both the context in which you're operating and also the objectives that either you have set or have been set for you, thereby providing you with the goals or the aims that you're actually trying to achieve as a team. So step number 1 is our context and our objectives. Now, by context, we mean both that internal environment in which we're operating as well as that external environment that we probably don't have any control over. In both cases, what we're looking for here are things like what has been changing in the past through until now, but what kind of changes might we foresee coming towards us in the future within our internal or our external context. From our external perspective, these often incorporate things like where are we in the world, and so what sort of political or economic or environmental influences might we see, but also what kind of societal changes might we see, or perhaps technological changes that could impact on the way that our particular industry or organisation works. Internally, within our organisation, we can also see these sorts of changes, but perhaps more usually they're to do with who do we have available to actually do our work, or what sort of capital might we have available to help us achieve those objectives. Now, on that note of objectives, those objectives may be something that are they might be very well established, or perhaps they're things that actually we just have a vague idea around what it is we're trying to achieve. Now, whilst it is always better to understand what our objectives are before we then try to identify and therefore understand and manage our risks, it isn't an absolute prerequisite. So therefore we can get on with trying to understand what our risks might be, even if we don't truly know what those objectives might be to start with, because risk management can be used to help us refine what those objectives might be. The final thing to be said on step number 1 is that it's this step that really helps us pitch our risk assessment at the right level in the organisation. Because if we're talking about our organisation as a whole, then our context is going to be just that. We're talking about the entirety of our organisation, and so therefore what are our ultimate objectives that we're trying to achieve, be it this year, over the next 5 years or longer. Whereas if we're doing our risk assessment for a much more discrete part of our organisation, say a particular team or maybe a project, then of course our context will be much narrower, it will be much more specific to what we're doing. It is therefore this step that helps us set the scope for the risk assessment that we're then about to take. That therefore takes us into step number 2. And step number 2 is where we actually begin to truly assess our risk. Okay? Now, within step number 2, so our assessing of our risks, there are 3 different component parts. Okay? Now, the first part that we come to in assessing our risks is the identification of what those risks may be. So just pointing our finger at those things that we think could be risks, so could be things that are uncertain, that if they occur could have either a positive or a negative effect on the achievement of our objectives. So pointing our finger at what we think those risks might be. And what we like to do is to make sure that we incorporate absolutely anything that could be a risk at this stage. It can be incredibly dangerous for organisations to introduce certain criteria at this point, i.e. deeming what could be an important risk or a less important risk, because often then it means that we miss some of those risks that actually with a little bit more thought and a bit more integration across our organisations, could turn into big risks. So simply put, step number 1 within assessing our risks is all about identifying anything that we think could be a risk. So that is identification. Step number 2 is about understanding our risks. And there are lots and lots of different tools and techniques that we can use to help us truly understand whether a risk is big or small, or it's something that we maybe want to do something about within our organisation. There are so many different techniques that you can use here. I'm not even going to begin to list them. But it's important to note that you use the right tool for the job, or use something that you're actually comfortable with utilising or facilitating, especially if you're running a risk workshop. Now, within the understanding of our risk, often things that we like to pull together here is what could the impact of that risk be on the achievement of those objectives that we've set here. Also, we can incorporate into here not just our objectives, but also the values of our organisation. So the nature in which we might achieve those objectives. Okay, so making sure that we continue to be a responsible company when we're trying to manage those risks as a whole. Also, we can incorporate things like the speed with which a risk might manifest, sometimes called the velocity. Sometimes we talk about how close a risk is to us, which can also be a factor of that speed. So we might talk about our proximity to that risk, or the proximity of a risk to us. Finally, it is quite common for us to talk about the likelihood or the probability of a risk occurring. And this is very, very normal within risk management. However, what we've seen is that likelihood can be incredibly difficult to measure for a whole wide range of risks. It's very easy to do where we have the data and a risk is well understood. However, that's not always the case for all of the different risks that we might come across within enterprise risk management. So therefore, what we're seeing actually for many organisations is a move away from using likelihood as being one of those prioritisation tools, and instead using something like velocity or proximity, or more commonly, does action need to be taken, or how good are your controls, using that as one of the mechanisms when we're trying to understand how important could a risk be to us. So the second stage within the assessment of the risks is understanding. The third stage is where we work out, well, do we want to do something about this risk? Okay, we cannot manage all of the risks that we face in a project or within our organisation. It simply isn't possible with the resources that we typically have to hand. So our final stage here is where we look at the so what. So do we actually need to manage these risks as a whole, or is it something that we're quite happy to leave to one side? So this is the so what. Now, for those risks that we've decided we actually want to manage, we then pull them on into stage number 3, which is where we get to the management of our risks. And it's into here that we pull all of our controls and our understanding of what those controls should be. Now, lots of different organisations do this in a different way. You may have control performance standards, you may have different ways of designing, implementing, operating your risks, and your controls as a whole. So what do you want to do here? Every organisation does this slightly differently. But it's in this management area where we make sure that the right level of resource is actually allocated to the management of those risks. And that then leads us on into step number 4, which is where we go into our monitoring of whether the management of those risks is actually working. So are our controls really working? But also what might be changing with regards to those risks, or indeed the context in which we're operating. We also want to review what is going on as well. So within the review, we probably also include some reporting. And so therefore communication out to those key stakeholders who need to understand if our risks are truly being managed. So in here, this is all about analysing the data that we've got, but then also communicating to the broader world whether we've actually managed to get these controls to work, and so therefore are these risks under control, or are things changing so fast that we can't possibly begin to control some of those risks. And all of that then feeds back into step one again, okay? Because this is an iterative process. We're never going to understand everything about our risks, because what we're dealing with here is the world of uncertainty. We're trying to predict the future, and so there's always going to be stuff that we just don't understand. But what we're trying to do with this very simple 4-step process is to make risk-based decisions. So we're trying to understand what could those uncertainties be they potential opportunities or threats, and therefore what do we actually want to do about them. So this is our risk-based decision making. And that is our risk management process. The whole purpose of risk management is to help us make decisions based on the best available data that we have to hand. And so the final thing to be said about this 4-step process is that based on the context in which we're operating and the objectives that we're trying to achieve, whether we've set them for ourselves or they have been set for us, and the risks that we face, be they potential opportunities or threats, and our ability to manage them, is it actually possible to achieve those objectives? If the answer is yes, then great, carry on. We've got things underneath control or under control. If the answer is no, then we have 2 options to hand. Option number 1 is to pile more time, money, effort into our ability to actually manage those risks. Option number 2, if we can't put any more resources into the management of our risks, is to have a think about those objectives. Because what we're saying is that given the current context, given the risks that we face and our ability to manage them, we can't achieve those. So maybe we need to change those objectives and make them more achievable or more realistic in terms of what we're actually trying to do as an organisation. So this is where risk management truly links into the success of our organisation. It acts as that transparent escalation tool throughout our organisation where we can say, yes, we can achieve those objectives, or actually, no, we can't. So we either need some more resource or we need to think about those objectives because they may not be set at the right level. Also within organisations, this allows us to hold one another to account, because what it allows us to do is to say, okay, if we want to achieve production targets, but we want to do them safely, is it actually possible to do this given the risks that we face and our ability to manage them? And it's this push up to senior management where organisations have been able to say, actually, we can't quite achieve those objectives given the resources that we've been given at the moment, okay? So what do you want to do? Do you want to change the objectives, or do you want to give us more resource? Which is the one you want to go with here? Because all of this is how we manage our risks, how we recognise our risks, and how we ensure that we are truly responsible organisations. Thank you very much.